even let's say, provided that it was not about the vote bank, right? Let's say if we remove that just for a second, even then,
Yep.
it's like first, all these large organizations, they have huge sales and procurement teams. So that part, and then the second part, the reporting part, like you mentioned, is a full-time job. I mean, for organizations trying to make an impact in these areas, you're just unnecessarily taxing them from a whole bunch of different layers.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's really difficult. And I mean, the other thing too is like even take politics out of it, just in terms of what you're thinking about. Like Great Slave Lake, which is one of the in the Northwest Territories, it's Yellowknife, Hay River, and a whole bunch of other communities. It's crucially important. It's an incredible ecosystem. It flows into the Beaufort Sea, which is part of the Arctic Ocean. And it's one of the most fascinating lakes. It's barely had any research papers published on it. Lake Winnipeg, which is an important lake, has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and is undergoing constant monitoring. Our ship on Great Slave Lake had to be dry docked for the past 3 years because there wasn't enough funding to pay for it to go out to keep it going consistently and we subsidize it heavily, but it still was it was so expensive to run and there was so little funding that we would have had to shut our doors if we just had it going out. And there weren't enough science projects anyway, because there just wasn't the funding for it. But no cabinet minister, or at least no cabinet ministers that I know of, have a cottage on Great Slave Lake. That's a little bit different with Lake Winnipeg, Lake Ontario, the Southern Great Lakes. It's just it's not through any ill will. It's not because they're thinking I have a cabin on this lake and I need to do it. It's just because that's what they're exposed to, right? They're in the South. They're thinking about it more. There's constituents asking for. It's a lot easier for someone who lives on Lake Ontario to get to Ottawa than it is for someone who lives on Great Slave Lake, right? One other thing that's really important to know is that a key part of the Arctic National Strategy that we wrote, I talked about the funding structures, but the other thing is the government needs a holistic strategy. It needs a holistic strategy for dealing with for the future of the Arctic, for ensuring prosperity, economic development, environmental sustainability, reconciliation, all of those key issues. We don't have one. But more important, and a big part of the problem with that is that the departments aren't mandated to work cross-departmentally. So DFO doesn't have to work with the Navy or the Coast Guard or Agriculture Canada. They're not mandated to work together. In the United States, where they have a much smaller slice of the Arctic, but they have a full strategy for the Arctic that mandates all departments have to work cross-departmentally. And that means that they know what each other's up to. It means they can combine funding to save money on projects instead of doing like all this piecemeal siloed approach. And unfortunately, that's the way that a lot of things are done right now in the North. And the Inuit and Northern Indigenous people, they understand this. They take a whole of ecosystem approach. They see that, this one little animal is going to have ripple effects all throughout the food chain. Whereas so many science projects, and part of the reason why ARF, we have an interdisciplinary approach because we try to mirror the organizations we work with. We get very little. We just kind of started to get a small amount of funding from Environment and Climate Change Canada for one specific project in Great Slave Lake. Then that's the only federal funding we get at all right now, and we hadn't gotten any for years before that. But it is part of the reason why it's so hard for us to get funding is because we have that interdisciplinary approach, and the government doesn't like to work that way. They like to go, no, we want to know how this one individual type of phytoplankton is changing over this 3-year period in this one little geographic area. And instead, it's got to be broader than that to really get an understanding. And that's what people who live in the North understand, and it's something that we need to adjust in the South as well, and why we need a strategy to do that.